also how to give our roses a break. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. If you've got questions, definitely gather those up and we'll hit those at the end. If there's something that you need clarification on, absolutely, we'll go back and touch base on that too.
And
So,
by the way, just sorry to jump in, they can also enter questions in the chat if they like, and you can either deal with them immediately or wait until the end.
how about this, Simone? If you see something that's relevant and fairly short-lived that I can handle on the fly, go ahead and read that question to me and I'll do it. And if it's something you think is a little bit more in the weeds, we'll save that for the question session.
Great.
All right. Well, a little bit about me. I'm a recovering rocket scientist. I literally worked on defensive missile systems for most of my career. And as you can imagine, there's not a lot of beauty associated with that part of my industry. But there's a lot of science. And it turns out there's a lot of science in rose care too. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. You just have to be somebody who's consistent with things. And all plants do really, really well when we're consistent with them. That's why our environment is fantastic for growing. And I like to take advantage of that. So let me share some things that I've learned along the way with you guys. Now let's talk about the life cycle of the rose. Roses are hardy and they're really hard to hurt. They hang in there, they're pretty tough, but their life cycle isn't linear like our calendar is. It's circular. Everything has a birth and regrowth cycle to it. And we just have to be a little bit more in tune to that. For example, we look at our calendar and we know when spring starts around here. It's pretty much January 1st, right? Well, for a plant, it's really all about what the length of the days are and the amount of sunlight. So when spring kicks in, that's the starting gun for the roses. And they say, all right, let's start growing. And they spend an awful lot of energy and time getting ready to produce blooms, because blooms are the predecessor to rose hips, which are actually the seed carriers for roses. And the way that roses used to propagate was by dropping seeds and growing in a normal pattern just based on where they fell. That's not really the way roses work these days. We have to buy them, plant them, transplant them, care, feed for them, fertilize. So when summer rolls around here, which is probably around January 2nd, it's confused if it doesn't have that kind of dormancy period that they need to gather up their energy and get ready to grow in the springtime. Now, if we look on the right-hand side, you see the figure is a lot more circular. Everything is spread out over the year, except that our fall and our winter seasons are rather compact here. So we just have to kind of adjust for whatever conditions we're dealing with at any given time. Used to be by now, right before Thanksgiving, it was cold in San Diego. I had to turn on the air conditioner, I can't lie, about noon today. So we just have to be aware of what the environment's doing and look out for our roses and adjust accordingly. Now, the USDA has this thing called hardiness zones. Everybody throws around. I'm sure you have some garden nerd friends who say, well, I'm a zone 7. Well, I'm fortunately a zone 11. So what about that? What does that mean? All it really means is the USDA came up with a standard to say, what is the minimum low temperature that you're encountering in your region, because plants are tolerant down to a certain temperature based on their heredity. Roses are pretty hardy. In fact, there are roses that are grown where it snows all the time, but you have to adjust for the seasons. And so it's always good to know where you are now. It's real easy to pick us off down there in the lower left. Southern California is nice and warm. So you got some nice oranges and reds to indicate that. But as you move east and north, you start to see more cooler temperatures. Well, that's because the temperatures themselves are cooler, not just on the color map. And so we have to adjust for when spring actually starts, depending upon where our region is. I'll give you an example. So here's our normal calendar, and I've got the legend there for the topo map that shows what our different zones are. Well, here in San Diego, we enjoy really high, low temperatures. So there's only really a few months out of the quote unquote fall and winter that we need to let our roses rest. But if you start, say, moving to the east in Albuquerque, it's a lot cooler. And so the growing season becomes shorter And so you have to take that into account and start a little bit later, depending upon both temperature and altitude. So just become familiar with what your particular zone is, and that will help you in terms of picking plants, because typically the manufacturer, the distributor of those plants will have the zone marked right on it. Now, who can tell me what Chicago is? It's cold. Now you would go and look at this map and look at the light brown and light blue zone and say, oh, well, I can see that's a 5 something or a 4 something. And the answer is sure, it is, except when you've got the lake effect. So if you're really close to bodies of water, you have to knock that down a little bit more, because that humidity means a lot to those roses. Now, there's 3 main rose categories that exist. They're the old garden roses, and nothing is exact in rose care except for one thing. We've all decided for some reason that before 1867, those are considered old garden roses. Those are the kinds that have been around forever. They've been hybridized by people who were just learning how to figure out how to hybridize different varieties together. And they have a particular look. They also happen to be very fragrant, so people like them. Wild roses are more of a rambling, freewheeling type of rose that you'll see a lot of times in the Midwest, certainly in England, growing out in the wild. And they do really well. They're rugged. In fact, one of their rootstocks is the staple for grafting roses on, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And then the last category is modern garden roses. Those are roses that have been developed in the 20th century, and we're going to be focusing on those because those are the ones that we have access to the most. Now, within those 3 subtypes, there are 4 different varieties that are most commonly talked about when people think of roses. There's always that first rose that you've seen on a long stem, a nice hybrid tea rose. It's the classic bouquet rose that you'd see down at the end of the off-ramp to the freeway the night before Valentine's Day, because guys are forgetful. Well, that's the one that you're used to seeing, but that's not the only kind of rose that's out there. It tends to be a single bloom on a long stem with multiple petals in that classic rose form that you can see in the figure on the right. The plants grow medium to large size, 4 to 5, sometimes even 6 feet tall in areas like we have here in San Diego. And they have a subtle scent to them, a fruity tea-like smell. And I'm sure you've smelled those before in bouquets. Anybody guess why a hybrid tea would be called a tea rose? It's because it smells like tea if you get in there. They tend to be disease resistant because the growers don't want to have to mess with losing a whole crop because they got pests. And most of them are patented. Now, the next subcategory is part of the hybrid teas, the Grandiflora. And what people said was, hey, these are great, they're selling. What if we had a bush that could make more of them? And that's how the Grandiflora was developed. It's also a hybrid tea long stem type of rose, but it's got a lot more stems for a particular bush. It's also a multiple flowering plant too. The cycle of throwing blooms is a lot faster on a Grandiflora than it is on a hybrid tea. So you get more opportunity to get blooms per season. They tend to be larger, taller plants. I just came from a friend's garden that I was visiting, and you literally had to bust out a step ladder to get to the top blooms. That's how tall they can get. So you want to plan ahead when you're thinking about those type of roses, because they tend to be pretty large. The one thing is about hybridizing roses is that nature doesn't usually give you something without taking something else away. So a lot of the Grandifloras, unless they specifically been bred for it, don't have a strong fragrance to them. It'll either be very subtle or none whatsoever. So most of the energy goes into the forming of the blooms. They're always disease resistant because that's how they've been raised. And they are mostly all patented. Now the Floribunda is probably the ones you see the most. And that's the big bush that has multiple blooms exploding in the middle of springtime. And then it kind of limps along for the rest of the year. Well, that's not the bush's fault. It's got to be fed. And so Floribundas are very, very vibrant plants. They give off a lot of blooms if you treat them right. And that means that you have to feed them on a regular basis. And when I say regular, I'm not talking about, once in the morning, once in the evening, and make sure you take them for a walk. I'm only talking about once every 2 weeks. And if you fertilize them right, you're going to be rewarded. You're going to have blooms throughout the entire growing season for your region. Again, these are all patented roses and very strong. And then last, I want to highlight probably the best kept secret of the rose industry, and that's the Miniflora. Now people say, oh yeah, I know what those are. Those are the ones with the little tiny ones, little bonsai roses. Well, those are miniatures and people like them, but I mean, let's be serious. If we're doing that much work, we'd like to get some blooms out of them. So there's another variety here called the Miniflora. It's a subtype of the Floribunda, and it also has multiple blooms with fast repeat cycles. And the nice thing about it is it's a compact plant, so it's ideal for container growing. Instead of 6 feet tall, it ranges around 3.5 to 4 feet and not too broad. So it's going to be a smaller, more manageable plant, especially ideal for patio gardens. You're not going to get a lot of scent out of them, but there are some exceptions that have really, really fragrant blooms. And the great thing about it is they're well cataloged, because anybody who's going to be distributing them is going to showcase them really well. And I'll talk about some sources in a moment. Now, there are some other rose subgroups. They tend to be a little bit less popular, but it's good to keep them in mind. Miniatures, we already talked about. Those are typically going to have blooms on the order of about 1 inch in diameter. So they really are mini. Polyanthas are more of your wide-ranging brush roses. They also have small blooms. They tend to make hedgerows. Imagine you're out on the heather somewhere in England and it's a foggy morning, and then you see a hedgerow just covered with blooms. That's typically going to be a polyantha. Shrub roses are just that. They're basically floribundas that have just spread out and they're covering a large area. So you treat them a little bit differently if you have those established, because you don't want to hack them all back down to just within the ground level. You want to treat those a little bit broader. Ground cover roses are a newer thing that you see more and more in the SoCal region. They tend to be low-lying plants that spread out across the ground, and they provide a lot of color because there's multiple blooms all throughout the growing season. And then lastly, climbers. Everybody knows what that beautiful image of a trellis with roses hanging over it and dew dripping off of the branches in the morning. That's a climber. Now, I want to go off onto a topic that's not discussed that much when you see your generic website page about how to pick a rose. So most roses don't grow on their own rootstock if you're going out and buying them from a store. What you find is there's always this lump, this funny lump that looks like a scar right above where the ground is, where it comes out of the ground. And that's called the bud union. And the way that commercially grown roses are propagated these days is somebody actually goes and takes an existing rose, cuts everything off except a little bit of a stem that's sticking up above the earth, and then they cut a joint, a slice in that stalk, and then stick in the grafted type of rose that you want to grow. And sometimes they'll put some grafting paint over that to protect the wound, but that scars over and you get canes that are growing from that new type of rose that you've just grafted onto the old rootstock. The rose doesn't care. It's getting nutrients and it likes it, so it's going to grow there. But the old rootstock is still going to try and make a comeback. So oftentimes you'll see suckers shooting off from below ground level. And lo and behold, if you let them grow blooms, they're a different color than the top of the rose plant. Well, that's just because that's the basic rootstock. Now, rootstock was just kind of whatever you could get your hands on up until the release of the 1930 Patent Act for Plants. And what that did is it gave a 17-year period of protection for the patent of any hybridized roses. And that allowed distributors to get more creative and then actually benefit from their work. So it protected their work. That encouraged a lot of people to experiment with different rootstocks. Now, prior to that time, back in the old rose days, everybody found that they would just use this rather rugged workhorse type of rootstock They came from a particular Asian cultivar that was brought over long, long ago when the trading ships were moving back and forth between the Far East and New England. That was the plan right up until the time that these other types of rootstocks were identified as being beneficial against some pests. Dr. Huey on the list there to the left is that primary rootstock that most patented roses are grown on. And it's fine. It does great. It's got a deep taproot, so it goes down and it tries to find water. Except we all know here in Southern California, the water table is a little lower than a couple of feet. So that taproot doesn't really do anything unless you're watering the rose well. In the Southeast, in the Florida, Georgia region, the loamy soils there also tend to have a problem with something called nematodes, which are a pest that attacks the root system. And it turns out there's a different kind of rose that's evolved and is rather resistant to that. And that's called Fortuniana. So there are some East Coast, lost about 30 seconds of audio there. So what you don't see on this list is Home Depot and Lowe's as rose sellers. There's a good reason for that. They're just distributors, they're retailers, and they don't know roses from any of the other plants that they have out there on their shelves. It's more industrial rose hybridizers like Weeks and Star and Armstrong who are actually doing the growing and then distributing the roses through their own sales channels as well as others. They know a lot more about the roses, what they need, what's going to sell, what kind of roses people like. So those are the main sources that you want to look for in terms of a rose. Then there's another group that's a medium-sized set of growers that are more specialty. They tend to focus on a particular variety of rose they grow very well. In some cases, they've got their own proprietary grafting process. I've got a few names there, Otto and Sons, Cool Roses, and Burlington Roses that are relatively well known in large to medium scale distribution. And then there's the niche hybridizers who, they're the ones who really love to play with pollen and pretend they're bees and get in there and come up with these wild different colorations. You would never think that a red and a black would go together as a rose, but I've got examples of that that are just amazing. David Bang is a name that's really well known in that niche market. He comes up with a lot of colorful, high contrast roses. Wisconsin Roses deals with a lot of cold tolerant roses. So if you're up in Wisconsin or the eastern states, they're a good source. And K&M Roses are in Mississippi, just north of Mobile and east of Birmingham. And they specialize on grafting of Fortuniana rootstock that we talked about earlier. So it's good to know where they come from, but also where to go to for them. And so I've got a list of resources for you at the end of the presentation that you can always check out for your own research. So you know who distributes them. Where do you get them? Well, like I said, don't go to a big box store. First of all, those roses haven't been very well taken care of unless you get lucky and they happen to have a really great gardening section. Don't go to any nursery that's got sad looking roses, because that means that they haven't been receiving any kind of attention or feeding. And you don't want to start by inheriting somebody else's problem by getting a rose that hasn't been well cared for. And it's also inadvisable to cut them from your neighbor's yard because they don't like that so much. So it's always best to talk to somebody and ask if you can have some cuttings beforehand. Now, what you should do is you should take the time and decide what varieties really excite you. What's the kind of rose that you look at and go, I want to have that in a vase sitting on my windowsill. And then look into seeing what kind of rootstock do they come on? Who has those? Where can I buy them? Are they down at Armstrong, or do I have to send in mail order for that? Also, you want to take the time to go into some of those hybridizers and growers I've listed. They have beautiful catalogs. It's kind of interesting. The bigger companies have done an excellent job. They hire magnificent photographers and they've got the best pictures, fully color saturated. And then you've got the mom and pop places and they're focusing on the hybridizing. So they don't have time for a website. They just put up whatever they got and they say, here you go. If you got questions, call us. Do that. do that. Look through what they've got to offer and then figure out what it is you'd like to know about them and reach out to them. Some of them, they deal with you on a very quick basis with email, but don't be afraid to educate yourself about something that you want to buy, because it used to be we didn't even trust ourselves to buy shoes online. Well, now Zappos is doing pretty good at that. I think we can buy roses online. Contact those growers and verify that they have availability. Case in point, I'm just about to send out an order, a large order for roses for my business. And turns out my distributor got hit by a hurricane. They lost about 1,000 plants. And so the availability is kind of hit or miss as to whether they've got what I need in stock. So I send out my list and I find out what they've got, and then I make some decisions. So now is definitely the time to be reaching out to those growers, because planting season is coming. Now, you've gone through and you've made your list of things that you want to shoot for in a rose. And now you've got another decision. What am I going to do with it? Well, typically when you get home with a rose, you've got a liner and it's maybe got a couple of blooms on it. Maybe it's late in the season, it doesn't. It's fine. It's doing just fine in its liner. The one thing you want to do is get it into its new home. You want to make sure that it gets that new environment and make sure that you see 6 to 8 hours of sun. So they really are sun lovers. But you don't really want to futz with it because it's doing fine the way it is. You want to give it a while to get acclimated to the new environment. So just take that liner, put it on a tray so that you've got an overflow for water, so that you've always got a source of water for it to suck up if it should start getting a little bit dry, and get it acclimated without changing any of the other variables. And then once it's gotten used to that environment, then you can start talking about transplanting. Now, a lot of people like to go straight to ground. I advocate against that because the fewer things you can do to your rose, the better off it's going to acclimate. So typically what I like to do is encourage people to transplant their container rose into a bigger container. If you take that root ball out of the liner, what you find is it's full of roots. Typically, the distributor has kept it for a year and it's mature. It's been through an entire growth cycle. And just like the Germans wanted to find more room, it needs Lebensraum. It needs space to occupy. And so you need to have a bigger container to put that in. So you want to look at something that's at least 50% bigger in volume. So doing the math, that ends up to be about 25% bigger in diameter, roughly. And you want to have something that definitely is not a clay pot that hasn't been glazed. The Greeks used to cool off liquids through transpiration cooling by putting them in clay pots, and the evaporation would actually cool down the temperature of the contents. It also dries out the contents, so you don't want to do that to your roses. What you want is a nice glazed pot. You can see in the middle image there, there's a sort of a matte glazing to that pot. Turns out the one on the right's okay too, because it's fake. It's actually plastic. It just looks like it's a clay pot. Those are perfectly fine as long as they've got a drain hole at the bottom. You want to make sure that's there, because if you ever smelled rotting roots, it's not a pretty sight. So you want to make sure that you've got good drainage from the bottom of your container. So let's talk a little bit about how you would go and prepare that container. So you've got your larger container and you want to collect all of your materials ahead of time. First, you want to prepare that larger container by giving it good drainage. Well, there's a couple of reasons you want to put some things in the bottom. First, you want to make sure that there's good flow of the water out, so that if there's any overabundance of water, you don't have your roots sitting there soaking. So you'll want to make sure you've got that weep hole in the bottom. You might want to cover that with some weed block to make sure that the roots don't grow out of it, or your dirt doesn't just flush out of it. Because, yeah, let's face it, you paid a lot for that. You want to hold on to some of it. And then on top of that weed block, what you'll do is you'll add a couple of inches deep of gravel. It doesn't have to be pretty river rock like we've got here in the picture, but something where the water is going to percolate through it. And why do you need 2 inches? Well, turns out that's about the right weight. Sometimes wind kicks up. You don't want to have your roses knocked over. Sometimes things grow legs in the neighborhood and find another home. One of the funniest things I saw was coming home. I saw somebody on my porch as I rolled up, and they were trying to pick up my container rose and move it someplace. I don't know where. And I stepped out and I said, "Hey, that looks pretty heavy. Do you need help moving your rose?" And they're like, "No, it's fine. I'm just dropping it off." And I said, "Oh, good, because I was really hoping you weren't going to take it." It had 3 river rocks in it that weighed about 40 pounds. So it's a little bit more than they were banking on. Well, if you put gravel in there too, that'll weigh things down just fine. So you don't have to worry about putting them on your porch if that's where you've got your sun exposure. Just make sure you've got a little bit of weight inside. Then you want to start adding the soil. Well, what's good? Planting mix, cactus mix. There's nothing magical. You're going to be amending it. All you want to do is make sure you've got loose soil. And cactus mix is very granular, and that's why people like to use that for potting roses, because the roots are really easily established in that type of a mix. So you want to put in a cone, you want to put in a little pyramid at the bottom on top of your gravel, and you want to put the height just such that when you place the root ball of your container rose, when you remove it from the liner, you want that bud union to be even right with the top of the lip of your container. Well, wait, I thought that was supposed to be down in the container. Well, it is, but here's the great thing about that loose planting mix you're going to use. It's got air trapped in it. And so when you water that the first time, that whole thing is going to compress down a little bit. That air is going to be compacted. And sure enough, that bud union is going to drop just below the rim. So that's exactly where you want it. Then once you've got it in the right height, you're going to backfill that all around the sides. You don't need to tamp anything down because you don't want to make it too compact for the roses to spread their legs through. You definitely want to make sure that it's nice and even, and you want to make a little bit of a depression in the middle once you've done the first watering. That way, any of the water that you're going to be adding later and the nutrients are going to be centered inside the container and not running out down the sides where they have less use. Now, I'm going to mention that this is in here, and ground planting is almost the identical process. It's just that instead of going into a hole in a pot, it's going into a hole in the ground. The thing I got to caution you on there is never try and put your $25 rose in a $5 hole, because if you don't take the time to prep that hole and make sure that it's good for your rose, you might regret it. First time I had my home and I was all ready to set up my rose garden, I went out, bought my favorite roses, dug a bunch of holes all nice and lined up, got the fertilizer in there, filled them up with the planting soil, and then watered them really well. About 3 weeks later, there was this horrible smell outside. And I went outside and I looked at the roses, and the roots were rotting because the soil was saturated with water. I lived in a clay area and the water was going nowhere. So when you dig a hole in the ground, what you want to do is fill it up to the rim with water, go away for an hour and come back and see if it's drained. If that hole hasn't drained completely, then you've got a percolation problem. That means you probably have quite a bit of clay in your soil. So you're going to have to amend the soil or consider going above ground with raised beds. Everything else is pretty much the same. Now, I've been talking about container roses the whole time. Well, some people actually already have nice roses in the ground already. What do I do for those when it's time for them to sleep? Well, the answer is always, it depends. It depends on what the season is like. It depends on what the temperature's like on the 13th of November. I got 92 on my porch, so my roses aren't quite ready to take a nap. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until the days are a little bit shorter and the temperatures come down, which is typically around the first week of December. And once that's happening, now I know that they're ready to go to their dormant stage. I'm looking at them all the time, make sure there's no pests that sweep in at the end of the growing season. But that's where I want to be prepared so that when December comes and start getting the cooler temperatures, I can move in and do what the winter planting is that's necessary for established roses. And this is true for container roses that have been established for more than a year, as well as in-ground roses. So one of the first things you want to do is get good equipment. There's so many videos online. YouTube, just do a search on pruning and you'll find a whole bunch of really good videos. But the main thing you want to have is a good set of bypass cutters. Those are the typical rose cutting shears. You can see the tips of them here in the middle picture. And just consists of a solid anvil and a slicing blade. You want to make sure that's nice and sharp, lubricated well, and that there's no space, no slop in them. So I always tend to spend a little bit more on my pruners so that they're going to be robust, and I always clean them afterwards. Rust is horrible for them. You want to have a good pair of gauntlet gloves too. What are those? Well, they're like gardening gloves, but they come up to about this far, up to your elbows. And anybody who's got a lot of thorns or prickles on their roses knows why. I don't know how many times I've had to carefully remove my arm from several thorns on several different canes as I dove into a plant. So once you've got the right equipment, you also want to take care of yourself, because roses like sun. Our skin, not so much. Make sure you remember to protect yourself, because you could get engrossed in your roses and you don't want to forget about your skin. Now, let's talk about how we attack an established rose. Well, turns out they're really robust. You don't have to be that touchy with them. You want to basically go by the rule of cut them in half. If you've got a 6-foot plant, take them down to 3 feet. Chances are you're in a growing area where it's not going to require taking the canes all the way down and putting mulch over them. So if you've got a 4-foot plant like the Floribundas we were talking about and the Minifloras, take them down to 2 feet or 18 inches. But just remember that they're going to be dormant in the garden for a little while. So you always want to leave a little bit such that you can do a midwinter pruning that's going to take them down to an established bud eye once you start to see some growth. And I'll explain that in a moment. So first start off by taking off by half and then forming them by basically trying to make a reverse pyramid. You've got outward growth on all of your canes, but you don't want to see a lot of clutter on the inside. In fact, the temperature inside a rose plant can be as much as 10 degrees higher than the ambient air temperature just because of the lack of air circulation. So you got to clean out that center section. So what you want to look for is a lot of crossing canes, is what we call them. You want to look for cane stock that's come up from the base of the rose and actually moves towards the inside of the plant. Those are the ones you want to preferentially get rid of, plus any that show any kind of disease on the canes themselves. Once a cane is damaged or been attacked by a pest, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do except to prune them back. So you want to check for all those things, because that's easy. That's the low-hanging fruit of pruning. And once you get that, you'll notice you know what the next one to cut is, because you can tell from the shape of the plant, oh yeah, this one doesn't belong and that one does belong. So pretty soon you're left with somewhere between 4 and 7 canes on your plant, depending upon the size of it. And then the key is to always cut it back so that it's going to have a good chance of putting all of its energy into growing from those canes. So we always look for a bud eye, and that's the place on the side of the cane where there's a little bit of a nub, and that's where the new stem is going to come from. Once you find that, you're going to want to cut at a 45-degree angle, just above it, about 1/4 of an inch above the bud eye. Any closer and you risk damaging that bud eye, and that's going to interfere with its growth. So you just want to nip it off there. Again, here in Southern California, we don't have to really worry that much except in East County for freezes. So we don't have a lot of risk of those exposed tips getting damaged by frost. If you do live in one of those areas, you may want to cut your canes a little bit extra long. Let them get through that freezing season in typically late January, and then you can go ahead and cut them back to that bud eye. But what you want to do after you've done that, you haven't finished pruning until you get rid of all the junk. Because let's face it, it's tough to stay clean in the garden. There's always going to be foliage that's falling down, and that's a real good breeding ground for pests. So you want to get rid of all of that extra foliage, any of those spent petals, anything that's fallen off the tree. Maybe it's stuck down in the middle of all the canes. And also you want to look for those nasty spider webs that you sometimes see. Those are actually spider mites. They're insects that are really damaging for the roses. So you want to clear that out so that you can start fresh in the springtime. And then you want to use some dormant disease spray. Neem oil, for example, copper fungicide. I've got a listing of that here on the next page here. There's one particular spray that I'm going to caution everybody on. It's called spinosad. It's very effective to avoid any kind of dormant diseases. It's not good for bees though. So you want to make sure that you spray that early in the morning before the bees are out pollinating. Now I'm going to take us a quick sideline. We're almost done here. I just want to mention the fact that, boy, when you walk in and try and pick fertilizer, it's like buying ketchup in the store. There's so many different varieties. The hell do those numbers mean? Well, it's real easy if you break them down into three simple groups, N, P, and K. Well, and that's kind of easy. That's nitrogen. And then P, well, that's probably phosphorus, potassium. Yeah, it's phosphorus. And then there's that third one, K, for potassium. Makes perfect sense, right? Potassium. Well, it turns out it's Latin. Kalium is this symbol for potassium. And all three of those nutrients there are key ingredients for feeding plants, all plants. It's important to know when you're spending money on your fertilizer that you're not wasting money on nutrients you don't need, and you're getting the right nutrients at the right time in the growing phase. So it's key to know the background behind them. Now I've got some generic sources of those different minerals listed here. The blood meal, bear with me on it. I always mix up blood meal and bone meal. The blood meal is really the source of nitrogen. It's an organic source, unlike your lawn fertilizer, which can burn your lawn if you leave it out there in the hot day of the sun. Same thing with the roses. You always want to go with an organic mix to get good cane growth and good establishment of your roots. Bone meal is a good source of phosphates, and you want to include that in your hole when you're planting or transplanting your rose, because it goes at the bottom where the roses are going to grow their roots towards. And when they get there, you've got this nice source of phosphorus for good establishment of foliage when that part of the growing season comes. And then finally, the potash, the potassium source, that helps with the immune response, and it also provides renewing energy to the plant so that after you've had that first bloom, it's got energy to put out the second and third bloom. So that's an important part of your fertilizing too. So when do you want to do that? Well, you do a first feeding once you've done your transplanting into the growing season. So here in San Diego, typically Valentine's Day is that rule of thumb. That's when you start considering the growing season. And so you'll want to make sure that you get it off to a good start and give it a good fertilization for that first week. And that's basically where your fertilizing season starts. I won't go into the details there. These are all commercially available fertilizers, but they each have a certain thing that they do for the plant. So it's good to make sure that you cover them all. And then you want a recurring schedule that you can stick to. It doesn't have to be that hard. Every couple of weeks, you want to fertilize your roses. It can be as simple as a handful of fertilizer or putting the fish emulsion, which smells exactly like you think it sounds, right into your water, and you just hand water them while you're doing your normal daily watering. You just have to keep track of it and make sure that you don't let too much time go by. Otherwise, yeah, they'll talk to you. And the way they say I'm hungry is they turn leaves yellow, they don't develop blooms, and they get pests. So they won't say anything, but you'll know if you're listening to them. I've got a few rose resources here for anybody who's interested. This is something that's provided by the San Diego Rose Society, and it's different distributors and hybridizers of roses that have been really good sources over the years. So not only do we have some good local to San Diego suppliers, but there's also a lot of online suppliers that anybody can find on the internet if you just use the right search string. So if anybody wants to have this information, I can also email that to you afterwards. And that covers the beginnings of what I wanted to talk about for the care and feeding of roses. And I'd be happy to open it up to questions. If you have some that you develop later, definitely take down my email, myroseguy@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to help you with anything that I can.
That was terrific, Matt. Thank you so much. I think Eva had a question. Are you there, Eva, or do you want me to ask it for you? Well, I guess she was asking about the dormant rose sprays, what the names were.
Sure. So neem oil is a weird name. NEEM. You can see it here on the right-hand panel here of this slide. Basically, what causes dormant diseases to take hold is they grow on the surface of foliage, but if you take that off, well, you got half the job done, or on the surface of the canes. And the neem oil basically asphyxiates whatever's trying to grow there. So it's very low, it's non-toxic, it's low impact to the canes, but you want to do that in the early dormant season. You don't want to do that in spring. So it's right after you've done your pruning. Copper fungicide is a generic name for basically a spray that you would add to a pump sprayer. And that's really good as a mildewcide. It gets rid of any kind of dormant spores that are sitting in your garden. So you also want to spray the ground as well as the plant, and you want it dripping. You want to make sure you get really good coverage. There's a couple of other ones out there, but spinosad that I mentioned before, it is a bit of a toxic spray for generic garden use, not for people. You don't want to be breathing it in. You want to make sure you use your mask with it, but it's not something that's really conducive to the growing cycle. And it's really hard on bees. So you want to spray that early in the morning, right after sun up for the first hour is probably the best time to apply that. And again, you want to do that when you see an outbreak immediately, but more importantly, before one occurs. So that's why you want to use it as a dormant disease spray.
He also asked about how often do you spray the neem?
It typically is only used once a year. You do that immediately after you've finished all of your pruning and gotten all of the foliage out of the garden. You just got bare stalks. That's when you'd want to apply it once.
Anyone have any other questions for Matt?
We'll go ahead and throw it. Yes.
Okay.
One other thing I'll mention too, and that is a lot of people are getting warmed up to the idea of growing container roses or raised bed roses. And one of the benefits of that is you control the entire environment, except maybe the rain and the sun. But you control what ingredients go into your potting mix, your planting mix, your fertilizers, and that can be really successful. Don't get overwhelmed with the idea that I've got to be doing all this recipe building. It's real simple. You do one thing once and you do the same thing many times over the growing season. It's very rewarding. Another thing that's important too is make sure you get a pot that you like the looks of. It's ornamental. You want to enjoy what the look of your plants are out in the patio. Get something that goes with the house. Get something that has a nice earthy feel to it. And then thirdly, don't be afraid to take that liner that you got at the store and just slide it into a pot for those first few weeks. It's going to look great. It's going to be in the right spot because that's where you're ultimately going to transplant it. And it also helps the plant's root ball get used to the conditions, because there's a big difference between having a thin layer of plastic wrapped around your root ball versus a big earthen clay pot with glazing on it. So definitely think about what you're going to be transplanting into at the time that you purchase or you receive delivery of your rose.
Well, that was terrific. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I thank you for attending, folks that took the time to come here, and the video in the next few days will be edited and uploaded to San Diego's Mensa's YouTube channel. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Matt. This was really wonderful. And I'm going to end the recording here.